Today, we turn to one of the most puzzling conflicts of the 20th century, the China-India War. This is part 3 of a three-part series on India-China conflict. 1962 was a year of 25 armed conflicts, and yet this one stood apart. Swift, decisive, utterly shocking. China attacked, India collapsed. And then China simply withdrew, unilaterally. No conquest, no annexation, just silence. A war fought and then deliberately concluded. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was devastated. This was not just a military defeat, it was personal. The China-India relationship he had once framed as civilizational partnership, two brothers in anti-colonial struggle, collapsed into strategic distrust. An idea collapsed. Hindi-Chini bhai-bhai became Hindi-Chini bhai-bhai. So the question is not just what happened, but why did it unfold the way it did? Why did China act when it did? Why did it stop when it did? And why did the two leaders, Nehru and Zhou Enlai, fail to resolve a dispute that in other cases China managed to settle? This is a story not only of a war, it is a story of misreading, of missed signals, of gaps. Gaps in preparation, gaps in perception, in ideology, in assessment. And ultimately, a conflict shaped as much by misunderstanding as by force. By the end of 1960s, the foundations of the dispute were already in place. In the West, imperial cartography had produced competing claims. We examined that in part 1. In the East, agreements negotiated with Tibetan Authority left questions of legitimacy unresolved. We examined that in part 2. Independent India inherited these boundaries as settled. The Chinese Communist Party did not accept the assumptions behind them. What existed, therefore, was not a defined border, but a layered disagreement over territory, over authority, and over historical interpretation. At the center of it all were two leaders, Jawaharlal Nehru and Zhou Enlai. Nehru approached international politics through a moral framework: post-colonial solidarity, peaceful coexistence, a shared civilizational past and identity. He believed in frameworks like Panchsheel, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, foundations he thought could stabilize trust. And beneath that, a deeper belief that shared suffering under imperialism would bind India and China almost permanently. Zhou approached the situation differently. Not ideals first, but strategy. Having emerged from decades of internal collapse and external pressure, invasion and humiliation, his focus was not alignment, but consolidation, power and prestige. Throughout the 1950s, both sides communicated, but not always in the same terms. At times, Zhou Enlai indicated flexibility, including possible accommodation in the eastern sector, Arunachal in the east in exchange for Aksai Chin in the west. Nehru interpreted this as movement towards settlement. Zhou treated it as a test of Nehru's resolve. Language compounded the problem, not just words, but meanings. Suzerainty versus sovereignty, dialogue versus negotiation. They sounded close, but they were not. Small words carrying very different worlds. There were moments when resolution seemed possible. In the early 1950s, indication emerged that China might accept the eastern boundary as a practical reality. But these signals were never formalized. Ambiguity remained. And then a signal from elsewhere. Nehru compromised land with Pakistan in the east, a willingness to divide territory. In Beijing, that sent a message. India could bend. By 1954, the stage shifted to Beijing. Nehru met Mao. Warm smiles, measured words, carefully crafted calm. Everything felt stable. Nehru returned home reassured, but not quite entirely. There was a feeling, hard to define, easy to dismiss. As Neville Maxwell later wrote, Nehru sensed something deeper. In that room with Mao, he did not feel like an equal, more like a representative from a tributary state. Nehru noticed it, and then he chose to ignore it. Now, the heart of the story. 4 gaps. Not on the map, but in perception, in judgment, in the worldview. Nehru underestimated the strategic intent behind China's posture. Nehru believed China would behave with India as it had with others, like Burma and the Soviets, measured, reciprocal. But Zhou did not see India or Nehru as an equal, and so it did not respond in kind. Nehru's forward policy extended India's military posts into contested areas, but without corresponding logistical or military support. On the other side, China knew that Nehru had few options. Nehru, calling the United States, would break his non-alignment. Turning to the Soviets, uncertain and unpredictable at best. Nehru was cornered, and China knew it. Interactions between Nehru and Zhou Enlai became increasingly strained. Each operated with different frameworks of status and expectations. 2 leaders, 2 egos. At Bandung, 1955, Nehru helped elevate Zhou into the global stage, a moment of partnership, he thought, that slowly became or turned into rivalry. Zhou Enlai moved with precision, Nehru with stature, both aware of their place in history, and in that awareness came friction, perceived patronage, respect felt and withheld, not loudly, but enough to set a direction. Beyond the 2 leaders, the world was also shifting. China watched the United States closely. There was a fear that India and a restless Tibet could become a corridor, a launch pad for an American invasion of China. Then came signals that reinforced that fear. India granted asylum to Dalai Lama. India moved into Goa. Actions seen very differently in Beijing. On the Indian side, there was hesitation, a refusal to fully engage in negotiation. When China offered a swap, Arunachal in the east for Aksai in the west, Nehru did not take that bait. Nehru wouldn't commit a blunder again. He had already handed Kashmir to the United Nations a few years earlier, an issue that was pretty much already resolved in India's favor. This time, with China beneath it all, there was a deeper divide. For China, agreements could be tactical, flexible, revisable. For India, they were commitments, stable and binding. And in that difference, compromise became almost impossible. By October 1962, the situation had reached a breaking point. India's forward policy posts, isolated and exposed, were now easy targets. China moved decisively across Ladakh, across Arunachal. A coordinated strike. Indian defenses collapsed quickly. Within weeks, China achieved operational dominance. And then it declared a ceasefire and withdrew. No occupation, no expansion, just plain exit. Why? Not confusion, but strategy. You see, Beijing had made its point. Demonstrate superiority, assert its claims, and deliver a shock. And then step back. No prolonged war, no wider entanglement. No pushing India fully into the Western American arms. The message, however, endured. The 1962 conflict did not begin with military movement. It began earlier, in the gaps between two ways of understanding the world, between idealism and strategy, between assumption and intent. It ended not with territorial expansion, but with a redefinition of the relationship. The war ended not with conquest, but with something quieter and more lasting. China asserted its will, India was humbled. The story did not end there. Today, the Indo-China border remains active. The same distrust lingers. Clashes continue, tensions rise, then fall, then rise again. 1962 is not just history. It is a beginning, a prologue to a much larger contest now unfolding in the 21st century. The present makes more sense when we understand where it all began. If this journey into origins added clarity, share it with someone who values context over noise. Subscribe for more conversations that connect past and the present. Until next time.